facing east. And then the Khoi, apparently buried differently. Some say in an upright position, sort of facing east very often. Some on the side, embryonic position facing east. What they're looking at, amongst other things, and this is exciting stuff, is the plaque on teeth of these early types. And by looking at the plaque in a very scientific specialist way that they do, you can check on the diet that those people had at that time. And by virtue of looking at the diet, they can say these people were San Bushmen and these were Khoi probably because of the different subsistence patterns. The next informal lecture will be by Vicky. I don't know who. Legislation. Kind of a dry topic to start off with, but this is the backdrop. This is the screen against what we project much of what we've been talking about. Maybe I just should ask this question. Somebody came after a lecture in the course of the week and actually raised this issue, and there's a book, and the title escapes me now, where a lot of specialists contributed to this volume in terms of land. And Hessequa Khoekhoen, she's an Afrikaans celebrated author, always been very critical, objectively critical of every government this country has ever had. And she's now has this thing about land and land claims. And she's written quite a long article, well constructed, well motivated. But the essential question, that's not actually a question, the statement that she makes, what's all this land claim business? Land should not belong to the people. People belong to the land. Having a piece of soil, these are my words, not Hessequa Khoekhoen's poetic sort of way of saying it, doesn't guarantee anything, doesn't give you authority over people, doesn't. And this land issue, very, very topical, is still going to take this country of ours through very, very troubled waters. Not that it hasn't already done so. Now the legislation. Native Land Act of 1913. That Land Act then was designed to basically say in simplistic terms, this land is for the white people of this country, not for the black people who happen to be there, whether they were farm laborers or whatever the case may be, or whether they've been settled there for so many years. And that Native Land Act, infamous Native Land Act, indicated that, and it ended up being applied in this way that people must be relocated. White spots had to be made whiter and black spots had to be removed. And people were moved to native reserves, as they were called at that stage, eventually Bantustans or homelands as well. It was supported, was that Act of 1913, by the Native Trust and Land Act, that number 18 of 1936, same sort of story. And then with democracy coming to South Africa, Restitution of Land Rights Act. And that act said we must now go back to that particular act. And the key words in this new 22 of 1994 Act were people who were removed by force. That was the key, because that happened in some parts of the country. They were just told, by next Monday you must vacate this land, or else. And or else on Monday they came with a truck and just took those houses, piled them on, if there was time, and just took the people and deposited them somewhere else. So it was decided, this is the key, 1913, and from that date onwards, removed by force or by government action, or all those sort of more formal sort of indications of people having been removed from land. And usually also with a little rider saying without restitution, without compensatory land. Now, the previous government did a lot of strange things. But having done each of these little acts of moving people from A to B, almost in every case, they put them down somewhere else, which means, in technical legal terms, they were given other land. They were given compensatory land. Now, I've been talking about, not once am I talking about Khoekhoen, let's get back to the proper pronunciation just once. San Bushman people. Doesn't address that issue at all. Why? Because everything we've been talking about here is pre-1913. Pre-1913. They weren't and they aren't really on the agenda at all. Next legislation. The Constitution. I quoted from our Constitution during that first lecture, and it does point at these issues as well, the question of rights, Bill of Rights and land and education and everything else. But then came another act, and this government happened to rope me in for this 2003 Traditional Leadership and Governance Act, to look at traditional leadership as such. Because what also happened in the previous dispensation, quite artificially, people were set up as leaders, headmen and chiefs and all sorts of things, because they had all these parcels of land that had to be governed indirectly by the central government through a leader. So they created chiefs and headmen and stuff. So this legislation was supposed to just to sort out this sometimes serious confusion. But again, it still didn't. Well, it did. It did address the issue of traditional leadership as such. Not just the black communities, but also for Khoekhoen, the Khoi, the early Khoi, the San and that, in definitive sort of terms. But nothing ever transpired for the Khoi or for the San and the Bushmen in terms of this leadership. Their leaders, although acknowledged and legitimate and legal according to this act and accepted by their people, was never recognized and accommodated by the government. So then came, just last year, the Traditional and Khoisan Leaders Act, and we're still sitting with that portmanteau word now in this very important piece of legislation, and it's in the Constitution as well, Khoisan, man without cattle. That's what that means. It doesn't refer to people. It does refer to a language, languages that are related. I'm fairly comfortable with that. Mostly now spelled by the geneticists, as I said, even from Uppsala University in Sweden, Khoisan, K-H-O-E, and pronounced in this way. Should actually be Khoisan. But again, son being a derogatory word attached to that. Portmanteau word in the sense you can pour anything, you can put anything in there and carry all, as it were, but no proper meaning. But there it is. Now, supposedly, effectively recognizing and pinpointing the fact that the Khoekhoen, the Khoi and the San and Bushmen also have still got traditional leaders. By oral tradition and by succession, with some problems. We discussed this or mentioned it very briefly before. They are fly-by-night people who are now looking at this lucrative option of perhaps being recognized as a leader. And we'll go into a little bit of detail there just now. This is not doing the forwarding. Mr. Technician? Where's escape on this? Who's my coach up here? Thank you very much. Mr. Technical Advisor, I want to...
You've reached the limit of my ability.
Okay, somebody mentioned that she knows these people who march from here and there and everywhere to Parliament. These people are trying to make a statement, are trying to become less forgotten, are trying to become more visible. And this is what they say. This is the message this one particular group brought. Our government treats us like foreigners. This is what the representatives and the Bushmen said. and this is what they call themselves, Busmans. Ons is Busmans, we're Bushmen. They marched to the parliament in Cape Town, and they went there to establish an indigenous embassy, because they say, as foreign nationals, we should also have an embassy, not so? Maybe we'll get some acknowledgement and recognition by that. I like the image at the bottom here. They're also now threatening, said, this is just a few representatives. We're going to come back in numbers. And this is symbolically what they promised to do. Here they're shooting an arrow to Parliament. I don't know if you've ever seen a San Bushman arrow. It's a little reed arrow, very light, with a feather-like back, and then it used to be just a bone point. It's now made of metal that they get from the wire fences of the farmers in the environment. They make nice, more effective arrows. So the damage to Parliament at this stage, I think, will not be all that serious. Okay, now what these leaders are saying, the legitimate leaders who aspire to recognition, acknowledgement as leaders, and especially the fly-by-night ones. This is information. These are facts. A traditional king, according to our system, earns at least 1.2 million per year. Okay, there are levels of leadership. King, chief, and headman. They get a little less as you go down in terms of seniority. So they're not all kings. And the Khoi incident, the Khoi and the San Bushmen would never be able to aspire to kingship. Because a king, according to that traditional leadership legislation that I was involved in, indicates somebody who presides or governs over several communities. In the old terminology, several tribes, as does the Zulu king. The entire, what used to be Zululand, is under his jurisdiction. They're different communities. The Khoi and the San never had a centralized system where there was one leader. Even this powerful Gauko, remember the Gauko of Hessequa? He only governed or was acknowledged by the Hessequa community, the Hessequa tribe, stam, as the early Dutch also referred to them. So king, this is but now these fly-by-night people, and when I talk at one place in Riversdale, which is Hessequa country, I was talking about Hessequa and leadership and everything else, and there was a group of 7 sitting in one corner, and they said nothing. But their body language was absolutely aggressive from the very minute I started talking. And when the 40 minutes had run its course, one of them stood up and said, I am the counselor for our king. And you have it all wrong. You don't know anything about the leadership of the Hessequa people. This is our king. In fact, his surname is Hessequa. And I said, oh, interesting. Let's talk about oral tradition, heritage, where do you come from, etc., etc. Were you part of the 163 samples that we did for DNA? No, 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 no. But well informed in the sense that they know what this might entail if he is recognized as a king of the Hessequa. Now, Zwelithini is the king of the Zulu. He recently requested another 18 million for a new palace for his 6th wife, which would also be his 6th palace. He received 3.6 million to maintain his farms in 2012 already. And in that year, KwaZulu-Natal spent a total of 59 million on his household. Expensive king. Not quite in the league of Mswati III of Swaziland, but he's up there. Mpumalanga in 2015 spent 34 million. That's the year before last. It was in all the newspapers. You would have seen, some of you would have seen this, on new cars for their 2 kings and 58 chiefs. In 2014 already, 829 traditional leaders, and I'm saying the more senior ones, and then the lesser ones, there were 7,399 headmen. This is 2014, 2 years ago, cost the state 870 million rand. Now, it's a matter of recognition, acknowledgement. And this budget would be incredibly enhanced and inflated should these people come on board. But this is against this background is what we're talking about. But they're not there. They're not part of any of this, not even for 10 Rand. Well, I must say, I gave another little talk just towards the end of last year in Swellendam, and I invited Reggie Bussak, the acknowledged chief, acknowledged by the government, acknowledged chief of the Hessequa, to come along. And he did come along. And he made a point of wearing all his finery. And he had a wonderful, almost a brass-like looking, what can you call it? A kind of mace-like thing of indicating his office. And a bodyguard. So Reggie has stepped up one step. He's now recognized in the sense that his safety seems to be a concern of the government. He now has a bodyguard, and this bodyguard would drive him around in not a very fancy car, but he'd get in the back and he'd drive him around. So there are some signs, some early signs of some such financial or symbolic recognition of these people. This act, this last act that we looked at before, is intended to make a difference, to start this acknowledgement also in material or tangible terms for these people. Now the response. This is what these people are saying, these traditional leaders of the Khoi and the San and the Bushmen. They say it's false, these indications. There's no proper restitution, or there's a bit of a glitch there, or atonement. No acknowledgement of Khoisan genocide. Somebody came to me again this week after and said, you know what you're talking about here? Remember the smallpox and the skirmishes and fighting and the commandos that went after the Kham in the Karoo? It's genocide. It's a form of genocide. Recognize Khoisan as a First Nation. And there's an argument, as soon as I use this term, and this is a United Nations term, First Nation, and I mentioned to you that having gone to United Nations, to Genève, on behalf of the Karretjie people, they are now recognized internationally and officially as a First Nation. But the Khoi and the San aren't really. Well, not in this country. They contested. A lot of these present ministers who sit just a little way from here, if they're not in Davos at the moment, say this, that why are you saying you First Nation? Why do you think you people were here first? Questioning that. What the Khoi leaders are also saying, and this actually refers to what we said just now about land. He said, without land, we cannot have authority over our people. This is the way they see that. Okay, now the Karretjie people, some of them still traverse these arid spaces in the Karoo. They are not articulate. They are not organized. Their efforts aren't coordinated. They don't actually express their needs in terms of recognition or acknowledgement, not at this stage. And it's only outside people who seem to articulate a little bit what these people need and what these people are saying that they want. But they have no leadership that can speak on their behalf at this stage. The Khoi, a little bit different. The Hessequa, for example, they've got this leadership, they've got a council that helps Reggie Bussak. They're fairly organized in terms of now listing their membership, like formal membership and so on. But I'll get back to the general Khoi process, or the general efforts of Khoi on behalf of their people. It's a little bit different there. And then the basis of Soutpansberg. This is the sort of odd example, in terms of the 3 case studies that we did, they're not aspiring to be recognized as indigenous to the extent of we're actually Khoi, descendants of Khoi and so on, and they are. The DNA shows us, the genetic analysis showed us. But they don't want to be called coloured either. They're not coloured. That was a category, an artificial category, as we said a few times, created by legislation in the previous dispensation. And even before that, there was another category. Within 10 years after Van Riebeeck came here, they made a category because they couldn't stay with Chanokwa and Hessequa and Ataqua and Karretjie and all this stuff. Let's just call that, in 10 years' time, 10 years beyond their arrival, they called them Hottentots. A category of people, an amorphous sort of category, and that's where coloured come from. The Berries don't want to be coloured. They want to be base. We are base, the basis. And land, for the Hessequa and the Khoi in general, it's on their agenda. We'll have a look at that now. What are they actually asking? What are they now starting to demand? Beyond acknowledgement and recognition of leadership and individual people, the descendants of these early South Africans. Beyond that, they're also looking at land and various other things. Now, the bases have land, and I'll show you a little document just now, title deed to their land. Some of the Hessequa descendants have title deed to a patch of land, but they were all over this country, and that raises a massive question mark. Now, claims have, this first legislation, restitution legislation, said that by 31st of December 1998, your claim had to be on the table to be considered by government. Every province has a land claims commissioner, and there's a national land claims commissioner. They've got a vast staff of people in every office, in every province, and they've got a massive team of researchers. And every claim that's on the table, they are supposed to follow up and go and research the legitimacy of a particular claim. And this is where we as let's call us outsiders, or then from different disciplines. I did the escape, look at that. Come into the picture to also do research so that the more independent, if you like, perhaps even more objective research results are also there. So this is what the process entails. But then a lot of people complained. Many people didn't even know what this is about. I did some land claims research, and you ask for the list of claimants. They have to be a formal community. They don't accept tribe anymore. You have to create a community and a leader, and that leader and community then puts a claim on the table and say, we want our land back on the basis of this and this. This is where our forefathers lived, and there some graves of ours, and so on and so on. And then I would follow up in some of these projects and look at the list and go to these people and say, I didn't know my name was on the list. I didn't know I was claiming land. I know nothing about this. It's a fly-by-night lawyer who initiated this on our behalf, because he takes this massive commission if he's successful. So it's an uncomfortable sort of process. But then a lot of people, communities also complained, said, we didn't know about this land claims. We didn't get our claim on the table in time by the end of 1998. Incidentally, I saw some of these claims, they were actually dated like 10 to 12, 31st of December, which is a holiday. How that got onto the table officially, I don't know, but it was there. And they made it, but many people didn't make it or didn't even know about it. So this was extended. A new date was then set up till last year, middle of last year, 30th of June 2015. Now that has been put on ice because of a lot of technical problems. It wasn't thought through properly, it wasn't designed properly, but it's going to happen once they sort out the technical problems. Now the first cut-off date, the cost is projected to be 27 billion rand for that to be processed, and it won't always be successful. In fact, it will most often not be successful. The new claims, last year, 30th of June, will be between 129 and 179 billion rand to process those claims. And then the timeline, the sort of, the process is not very rapid. At the present rate, the old claims, the outstanding old claims, will take another 35 years to process. And if these new, last year's claims come on the table, according to the current process and momentum, it will take another 230 years to process. And now the Khoisan are saying, it's our land, we want it back. This is the kind of land we're talking about. Big sky country, they call it. That's the Karoo. The windmill, flat-topped hills. On the left is a Karoo road heading into I don't know where. How wonderful. Need therapy? Go to the Karoo. There you'll experience a deafening silence. On the right, bottom right, back to the Soutpansberg, base country. That is their land. They've got a title deed, but they're still fighting claims against that land from the Sarakalala, as we heard. Hessequa country, Langeberg in the back. There's one little peak, you don't see the profile here properly. It's called the Sleeping Beauty. Looks like a lady lying on her back with a profile, all very sedate and wonderful. Now covered by wheatlands, and in the proper season, if you travel into this bright yellow of canola fields. Beautiful rolling country. All of that, and as I said before, I walked and crawled all over that place looking for the traces of Hessequa and other Khoi. All those hills, in a sense, belong to the early Khoi. This is where they pastured the cattle. But then it wasn't a sedentary sort of thing. They moved from place to place. And how can you ever make a proper case, a formal case, if you don't have a demarcated land, a title deed, for example? Now, this legislation is very technical. It was designed by the present government. Land claims legislation on what basis? And you look at it, 3 or 4 pages of very technical thing. This is what's required from the claimant in order to process this and to have a successful claim. But here's the problem. The black communities too, they're also pastoralists, although they did become sedentary on and off, and they had agriculture as well. But certainly the Khoekhoen, the Khoi and the San, the Bushmen, have a different perception of land, of space, of belonging. It's ephemeral. It's more the space thing than the physical thing. It's often very poetic. You hear them talking about this land of theirs, and it's not demarcated. It hasn't got a title deed. So the legislation is calibrated in a way that it's almost impossible for any of these people to make a successful land claim. The requirements are technical. The information and the claim and the motivation is symbolic in a large sense. Outback in Australia, they were putting that one big railway through the outback. And so there's this big hill, almost a mountain confronted, and they said, right, we're going to go right through this. And then the local people, some Aborigines came and said, you can't go through that. This is a sacred hill of the Aborigines. I said, okay, well, show me what's sacred about that hill. It looks like a hill. He said, according to our song lines, this is where some of our ancestors emerged. I don't know if you know anything about the song lines of the Aborigines. It's like spaghetti. It merges from a hill and goes, and this is how the ancestors would end up wherever they ended up. These spaghetti trails all over the outback of Australia. An Indian community tribe, as they still call them, Red Indians. Are they Indian Americans or Indigenous Americans? The term changes a little bit. United States. Whether it's going to change at 7 o'clock tonight when they have a new president, I don't know. They were offered in dollars, this tribe, this particular Indian tribe, billions of dollars for their land. And they said they don't want it. Eventually there was a whole process, a legal process, and said, what is the story? And they said they'd like to come forward with the information to motivate this, that they want to land. And their main spokesperson said to the judge, I'm ready to give my information, but I need to sing. And the judge said, "You must be out of your mind. This is a court. We don't sing in this court." He says, "This is the way we do it." And then they left us for a few days, and they deliberated and discussed this, and he was brought back, and he sang about his ancestors and his heritage and his land and his space. And they wanted the land. They didn't want the billions of dollars. And that deal was never taken. That the Outback, if you go, take that Outback Railway, I don't know what's it called, across Australia. It goes around that hill now. It doesn't go through or over it or under it. It's a different paradigm. It's a very difficult one. Now, I'm going to bore you, and this is half of what I managed to get hold of. Just yesterday, we heard about those vases, those clay pots in Parliament. Incidentally, that's been removed. My informant, inside person, activated this whole issue, and the people who had these clay pots fashioned after the pots that the extinct Khoi used to make, that's been taken away. It was resolved overnight. But there was another movement of such people who are now acting on behalf of the Khoi and the so-called extinct Khoi. Let's just go down. Gauteng Khoisan Council, Western Cape Khoisan People's Land Restitution Council, Khoi activists, First Nation Indigenous Women's Movement, Khoisan First Nation, Khoi and Bushmen Cultural Organization, the Korakho, Khoisan National Resistance Movement, National Khoisan Council, Khoi Cultural Heritage Development Council, Khoi Cultural Heritage, am I repeating myself now? I'm stuttering. National Working Committee, the Khoisan groups concerning land reform and rural development, and more and more and more. Now, we'll see what the problem is here. They do have particular themes, identity, recognize us for the fact that we are the descendants, the direct proven descendants of some of the earliest people of this land. Land, I've discussed land. They want at least some of their land back to have access to land. Incidentally, the Karretjie people in the Karoo, their space, their land, they have access to none of that, except by permission of a landowner. They can't even access the space that is the land there. And then development, a few of these organizations are looking much more particularly at their little community and say, let's initiate some projects so that we have some development, let's have some progress in terms of that. So the themes, recognition, again, recognition, acknowledgement, please, just look at us. And then there's one of these committees, they had a big meeting in Khoekhoen in the Karoo, even addressing the whole issue of fracking, this potential drilling for gas underground in the Karoo, because in their, according to their perspective, they see fracking as also not a possible development initiative to their benefit, but as a negative for them. So they address all these different themes. And then media coverage. It was so nice to have this example, a real example yesterday morning in front page Cape Times, but virtually every week there's something about Khoi or San or people marching on Parliament and saying, look at this one again. That comes from another lot that marched on Parliament. Proudly Khoisan, they're at Parliament. This was the Khoisan First Nation. And the papers, the television, the media cover this. They get this exposure. But to what effect? Not at all. What successes? It's uncoordinated. You saw all those different organizations and movements. It's fractured. It's disparate. And there's rivalry. Even just within the Hessequa, to take one example, one Khoi group, they have 4 or 5 or 6 different houses of Hessequa, and each one with a different leader. And how can they ever speak on behalf of their community? It's a massive, massive problem. And last but not least, there are opportunists, people who just come to the fore. They've heard of King Swilitini. He's got 7 cars, etc., etc. They'd like at least just 1 or 2 of those fancy cars. So they're disillusioned. And I quote here, because I've been speaking about this all along. A very active person in this connection, also direct descendant, Khoi, from the Hessequa area. He has actually been in Parliament, represented one of the political parties, and he looks at this complexity of a so-called brown identity. He rejects the whole term brown because, and this is another person who wrote in the newspaper, the next one, the colored people, she says, is the nearly people. We're nearly white and we're nearly black. And then this one we've used before from Gideon Buysdorp, not white enough. Now we are not black enough. And then back to Sydney Opperman, and he's in direct, intensive contact with many of these San Bushman people and said they don't want to be called San. We are Bushmen. They want to be called Bushmen. He says correctly that San is derogatory, and this is not what they want to be called. They never ever, and this is a key for me as well, they never ever did the Bushmen call themselves San. It's a Khoi word for them, meaning people without cattle, implying thieves of cattle. They call themselves Tam or Haikum or Kum or whatever the case may be. And more recently, the Bushman term that they seem to be comfortable with. Now, we saw the depictions and perceptions, the colonial encroachment and settlement. This is the historical sort of, we don't have to go through all of that again. But progressively, they were denied citizenship. They became servants and even slaves on farms. They were recruited in the colonial military at one stage. They were drawn into the mission process activities. We discussed that as well. And they became part of a category that were called not only Hottentots, but still in southern Namibia, for example, if you go to Rehoboth, those people amazingly proudly call themselves Ons is die Basters. We are the Rehoboth Bastards. That's what they call themselves. People of mixed descent, also German, but also local, Namakwa people there. But they are proudly descendants of those people. Now, that is the legislation. In the previous dispensation, the Group Areas Act, many of you would have will remember that, 1950, and then also the Population Registration Act. And I've referred to this before, where black people were put into a certain category by virtue of that act, and white people, and also then residential areas and settlement areas were legislated. But then they ended up with this colored. What can we do? What's this category? They created this colored, and even on behalf of the basis and people like Rehoboth and the Griqua, they are grouped into that other subcategory, other colored, by virtue of that legislation. And this is what they're responding to now, the current people. This is not acceptable. This is not what they want. And this I've shown you before. This is what they're saying, coloredness must fall. All of them, all of these case studies, all three of these case studies that we've dealt with, not only by virtue of oral tradition, the soft sciences like anthropology, but also by virtue of genetics traced back to the oldest branch and even the oldest sub-branch of humanity, oldest people, the earliest people, descendants of in South Africa. The base people, of course, a little bit different here, particularly their Y chromosome, the male line. Right up there, the European, they've got a very strong one. You remember the French connection? Jean de Bois? It shows in the male line. It's up there. But in the female line, it's also centered around that particular branch. Title deeds. On the left is Slangrivier, given by Queen Victoria, that land, to the Hessequa people of that area. If you travel the N2, just a few kilometers moving in the easterly direction, out of Heidelberg on the N2, you look to your right, you'll see a little settlement there. It's called Slangrivier. It's a Hessequa settlement. That land belongs to them. But it's become smaller and smaller because of surrounding farmers in the early days giving them a few bottles of brandies or negotiating in what particular way, and they lost a lot of the land. But what's left still belongs to them. And there you have all the clay floors and the remains of the early chiefs of the Hessequa in that particular area. This is their land. That's one of the title deeds of one of the farms of the base people. King Edward VI signed. It was given to them by Paul Kruger. It was confirmed and emphasized later by the British government at that stage, and it was given to them in perpetuity. But still there are claims against that land, and they are wrestling with that as we speak. Okay. Might be quite romantic, and it is for artists. This is what they do. Hessequa people or Khoi people. I showed this little village on the banks of a river before, a leader, and I think this is what Reggie Bussak wants to look like a little bit. He's trying to emulate some of the early leaders when he comes to a particular function. This painting is artist that this is Koenraad de Buys. And very artistically here and there, not only the females that he cohabited with, and all sorts of other things, cattle rustling, his involvement in black communities. It's quite an impressive painting. It fetched an incredible amount of money when that went on sale. This is what artists are doing, this is what poets are doing, and this is what artists did in terms of Karretjie people. Encampment next to the road, Karoo in the background. Got a lot of money for those paintings as well. And then, of course, as I mentioned, people are writing about these people, novels and other such books, to the benefit of the Hessequa, to the benefit of the Karretjie people, to the benefit of the Buys people. Not at all. Not a single cent. And they're high profile people doing this in this country, acknowledged and acclaimed for their work, their plays, their poetry, their books. Very romantic. Last question. The beginning of the road or the end for these people? Somebody said, will I be talking around practicalities? Is there movement in the right direction? Are there some successes? No. More visible they are, more acknowledged by Parliament, by the legislature, particularly just before a local government election. A lot of meetings with the Khoisan. We're listening to you. We hear what you're saying. Minister Nkwetini in 2015 said, you Khoisan, don't worry. I've already put aside land for you in the Eastern Cape and the Western Cape. That's 2 years ago. No, a year and a half ago. Nobody knows where that land is. So I have to say, no real successes up to this point. But I thank you for your time. And lest I get emotional too, now I have to say goodbye to you. Thank you for your patience and your interest and even your enthusiasm. Thank you very much. I've become very disciplined, right on time. Now we're in question time. And we could be out here when I'm supposed to be out here. That was the first one.
A little while ago, there was an exercise to determine the authenticity of claims to kingship amongst African kings. And there were some who were, as a result of that exercise, who were disqualified.
Right.
Is there any hope of something similar happening in respect of the Khoi?
It has to happen, and it will happen. The first thing that has to happen is that they be acknowledged at all. Some of the leaders have now been acknowledged. They've been given bodyguards. That's a form of acknowledgement, an official car, if you like. That 2013 legislation, Traditional Leadership and Governance, set out, if you like, the criteria, and also requires that you go into the history of this. As I said previously, some of these leaders, Edmund particularly, and chiefs were set up by a previous government so that they could rule through them. And they are bogus chiefs. They don't have the support of their communities. And they've been identified and taken out. very low-key, but they've been taken out. The exact same process would have to apply to the Khoi, because there are, with respect, there are fly-by-night people, individuals who are taking a chance and saying, and every scientific bit of scientific evidence, even oral tradition and genealogy, let alone genetics, shows that they cannot be leaders of that particular community from that particular area.
I just wanted to ask, have you ever addressed the farmers in the Karoo? Because the farmers have their farmers meeting.
Yes, often. And there are some good news stories from the Karoo as well. Some of the Karretjie people have, let me use a particular, 2 youngsters who grew up as Karretjie people, as shearers. A farmer came to the fore and said, look, especially when the game farm started taking the merinos out of the district, he said, I've got another farm in another district, merinos, and he said, to make a very brief story of this, he set them up as farm managers, very successfully, independent, with all the responsibility. So there are good stories as well coming to the fore, and the farmers are playing a very, very important role in this. And a wonderful example is towards the east of Colesberg, about 42 kilometers, there's the Handam Trust. It's an educational center, started in a shed by 2 farmers' wives. Know them very well. I've been working with them for 20 years. Eventually got from the Mandela Trust significant money. Eventually got from overseas in dollars and euro significant money. It's now a campus of buildings with a computer room and everything else. The Karretjie children, the farmers, the farm laborers' children are there, have been educated and trained for viable options other than shearing and using a spade on a farm. There are some good news stories as well, thanks to farmers, thanks to the low, and also farming in partnership.
Would you say that much of the land claims are motivated purely by financial interests? Because I don't know whether you have the percentages, but I believe that even those that take the land then rent it out in terms of finance. They're not interested in going onto the land.
Yeah.
I think it's a little bit akin like Armstrong landing on the moon and saying, I'm claiming for America.
Yeah. What do I now do with this moon?
The question that I have, would you elaborate a little bit on the exploitation of Bushmen by the pharmaceutical environment?
Yes. Yeah, the medicinal plants in the environment, I mean, and also as far as the Khoi concerned, the Buchu, for example, to take your last question first. They commercialized this, made millions of dollars before the Khoi even got into the act. They eventually successfully managed to say, this is our stuff, this is indigenous, knowledge, which is very difficult to turn into tangible sort of things. But we have access to that knowledge, and it's been part of our heritage, our tradition forever. Ditto the San Bushmen with their knowledge of the environment. When I did Karretjie research over those many, many years, and I do have a section in that book, and elsewhere I worked with botanists and others. We made a fairly exhaustive list of medicinal and other plants that they used. Even some plants, herbs and stuff that they use for stress or blood pressure or even cancer. There's a little bush with white little flowers in the Karoo, kankerbos. And then some nice names, Pisbos and Bitterbos and all that, but they all can be by them identified as proper. But back to the use of land, there are 2 options for claimants. It's restitution and compensation. Let's take the compensation. More often than not, this community, and some of them didn't even know they were claiming, say, okay, we'll take the 5,000 rand. And that's what it used to be. So you want the land or you want 5,000 rand? Give us the 5,000 rand. 7 days later, the money's gone. Restitution, they take the land. Why? And I did massive projects in southern KwaZulu-Natal. Okay, sugarcane country. Smallish looking farms, but lucrative. And I discussed this with people, and they in the so-called trust land from Shepston's day, that the people in Natal, the Zulu-speaking people, live in trusts, still just bordering on these lucrative sugarcane and such farms, tropical and subtropical fruits and stuff. And so I said, now you're claiming that land, why? said, I also want one of those cars that the wheel is on the back. It's a 4x4, right? A Pajero or something with a wheel on the back. But more seriously, because some farmers were prepared to let go, they let them go at a certain price, or better news is they're working in a partnership with them and staying on the land. But often they let their farms go, and they wanted the land because they saw the profits, they saw the results of this activity. And some of them were laborers on that same farm. And they said, now I want this land. What they're saying, I want the profits. I want all these wonderful things that accrue because you've got the land. And within months, a farmer took me onto a hill, stood like this, a trust land over here, active farming land on this side, and then one farm over there that was sold. It's like black and white. I mean, it's the plants had just gone and weren't looked after, and they don't have the know-how and the planning and the projection and the financial backing and the support of the banks. It's just such a complicated process. So restitution has not been successful in many, many cases, unfortunately, either.
How do these communities mainly deal with the thoroughly matters? How do they make decisions on important matters together?
Okay, the most important matter that the Karretjie people, that's the question, how do they make decisions? Who acts on their behalf? Do they have a hierarchy or leadership system? Those who are still active shearers do have a hierarchy. It's a team of 7 shearers, maybe sons and brothers of a person, and then they very informally indicate a foreman. And his main job, the only thing that he can decide on their behalf, when they're in the shearing shed in the morning, they've now sharpened their shears, he'll say, okay, now we start, you can go and fetch your first sheep and we can start shearing. And when they break for lunch for that, he'll say, okay, now we stop, and everybody has to stop, so you don't carry on shearing and get a extra sheep in as opposed to the rest of the team. No hierarchy, very informal leadership. If they're back at the outspan and they have to go to a farm 34 kilometers away and they have to be there the next Monday, the one lot will pack up and start going. And another 2 families would pack up and go. There's no coordinated action. There's no leader saying, right guys, now we pack up, we're going. What he does also importantly do, because the farmer knows he is more or less a guy he can talk to. He negotiates with the farmer, negotiates. He interacts with the farmer, and the farmer says, you have to be there next Monday. And he is the person that the farmer talks to. Doesn't negotiate. The farmer says, this is what I'll pay you per sheep. It used to be 75 cents when I started working there. Went up to a lucrative 1 rand. I think it's almost 2 rand in some districts now for every sheep shorn. So he's the person that the farmer talks. There's no hierarchy. Only the family. Not even in the region. And I had a genealogy, I forgot to pick it up, I had it spread out here. Their main resource is not only district-wide, Karoo-wide by genealogy. I had it spread out over there and they connected. That's a resource. In the bad times they would go to other relations in another place.
Is not what you're speaking about really related to the compromise, the political compromise? Because in a democracy you wouldn't have traditional leaders, and I know that's been a huge topic. So the creation of a traditional chapter in the Constitution has created a different set of leaders, which has created some of the complexities that you're talking about in and out of our history.
Yes.
And has huge economic imperatives, which you've already unpacked.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could just comment on that.
Let me start with the end of my answer, not the what has also resulted from that you, once again, like in the apartheid system where you had Bantustanes or homelands, parcels of land, by effecting the traditional leadership system, you again have parcels of land, in a sense, belonging to different communities. Although they don't have ownership, it's a communal system, but it's under a particular leader, this parcel of land. So this land is again in patches. But back to the traditional leadership as such, when the committee that was to developed this legislation. I wasn't part of that. They called anthropologists and others at a later stage. When the government committee sat down for that 2003 legislature in terms of traditional leadership and governance, what they said, what the powers that be said, it was about in 2001, they looked at Ghana and Nigeria and Namibia and various other countries, and many of those countries do not have traditional leadership. They took that off. They wiped it off the books, off the constitution. And the first decision in this country was no more traditional leadership, mainly because the powers that be looked back into what I was mentioning just now. All these chiefs and headmen had been set up just because it suited the way that government was administering their affairs. So at first the decision was do away with traditional leadership. And then this constituency of traditional people, and look at KwaZulu-Natal, and look at the voting patterns in this country. Who votes for who? Look at Zimbabwe. Who votes for who? The traditionals vote for the current president in Zimbabwe in numbers. And if you do away with the traditional system, you don't have access to those votes or those leaders on your behalf. As soon as there's a problem, Mugabe, and I'm not mentioning our country, Mugabe goes off to the rural areas, and each person gets a T-shirt and a little bag of mealie meal, and he talks to them and says, "This is our land. You are my people. Just remember this stuff." So that, I think, is it's an uncomfortable thing. It complicates matters in this country, and it is horrifically expensive. Horrifically expensive. And it's by succession. You don't qualify to become a chief or a king or a headman. It's by succession. There was one successful succession in the new dispensation. One female managed to succeed her father, but she had incredible opposition. It's also patriarchal, patrilineal. Only males can succeed, except that amongst the Lovedo, Mujaji, the Rain Queen. She's the only female traditional leader in the country, and an effective one. I think okay. Yes, mostly by outsiders and by the presence like, let me take an arbitrary example in Colesberg. Lawyers for Human Rights set up shop in the main street after 94 in Colesberg. And they immediately took up the case for people in general, but also the Karretjie people. And unfortunately also, and it's an onerous task, outsiders act on their behalf and put their case and so on. Become public enemy number one in the district, anthropologists, researchers working in that area and putting the information on the table, the statistics as it were, this terrible, I mentioned that example a few days ago of Kota Noster and his family after 2 weeks of sharing and buying on the book at the store of the farmer, going away with 34 Rand. That sort of stuff I'll put to the fore. Or shooting the dogs. There's an encampment outspan near Colesberg. And one farmer young farmer came by and said, that must be the dog that's been getting at my sheep, about 19 kilometers away. Yet it was on leash next to the little house, and just out of his bucky, he took his rifle and shot the dog. And donkeys at one stage. He said once a donkey ran across the road and made a dent into his bucky. Those sorts of situations, those cases I took up personally and went to Lawyers with Human Rights. Very well-known person, incidentally, in that area, but I won't mention. So there were some successes, and I think the farmers became much more, and I shouldn't be generalizing. Many farmers don't need what I'm talking about. they're acting on their behalf and looking after the people properly. And as I said, some of them have helped that the people can generate, go into proper positions and stuff like that. But in general, it's still a very sad situation. Last question.
Why did Survival International not come here to take up the cause of the Bushmen? They've taken to the very highest levels the case of the Bushmen in Botswana on a number of cases and established the...
Facing east. And then the Khoi, apparently buried differently. Some say in an upright position, sort of facing east very often. Some on the side, embryonic position facing east. What they're looking at, amongst other things, and this is exciting stuff, is the plaque on teeth of these early types. And by looking at the plaque in a very scientific specialist way that they do, you can check on the diet that those people had at that time. And by virtue of looking at the diet, they can say these people were San Bushmen and these were Khoi probably because of the different subsistence patterns. The next informal lecture will be by Vicky. I don't know who. Legislation. Kind of a dry topic to start off with, but this is the backdrop. This is the screen against what we project much of what we've been talking about. Maybe I just should ask this question. Somebody very troubled waters, not that it hasn't already done so. Now the legislation. Native Land Act of 1913. That Land Act then was designed to basically say in simplistic terms, this land is for the white people of this country, not for the black people who happen to be there, whether they were farm laborers or whatever the case may be, or whether they'd been settled there for so many years. And that Native Land Act, infamous Native Land Act, indicated that, and it ended up being applied in this way that people must be relocated. White spots had to be made whiter and black spots had to be removed. And people were moved to native reserves, as they were called at that stage, eventually Bantustans or homelands as well. It was supported, was that Act of 1913, by the Native Trust and Land Act, that number 18 of 1936, same sort of story. And then with democracy coming to South Africa, Restitution of Land Rights Act. And that act said we must now go back to that. Came after a lecture in the course of the week and actually raised this issue. And there's a book, and the title escapes me now, where a lot of specialists contributed to this volume in terms of land. And Hessequa Khoekhoen, she's an Afrikaans celebrated author, always been very critical, objectively critical of every government this country has ever had. And she's now has this thing about land and land claims. And she's written quite a long article, well constructed, well motivated. But the essential question, that's not actually a question, the statement that she makes, what's all this land claim business? Land should not belong to the people. People belong to the land. Having a piece of soil, these are my words, not Hessequa Khoekhoen's poetic sort of way of saying it, doesn't guarantee anything. Doesn't give you authority over people, doesn't. And this land issue, very, very topical, is still going to take this country of ours through that particular act. And the key words in this new 22 of 1994 Act were people who were removed by force. That was the key, because that happened in some parts of the country. They were just told, by next Monday you must vacate this land, or else. And or else on Monday they came with a truck and just took those houses, piled them on if there was time, and just took the people and deposited them somewhere else. So it was decided this is the key, 1913, and from that date onwards, removed by force or by government action or all those sort of more formal sort of indications of people having been removed from land. And usually also with a little rider saying without restitution, without compensatory land. Now the previous government did a lot of strange things, but having done each of these little acts of moving people from A to B, almost in every case, they put them down somewhere else, which means, in technical legal terms, they were given other land. They were given compensatory land. Now, I've been talking about, not once am I talking about Khoekhoen, let's get back to the proper pronunciation just once. San Bushmen people. Doesn't address that issue at all. Why? Because everything we've been talking about here is pre-1913. Pre-1913. They weren't and they aren't really on the agenda at all. Next legislation. The Constitution. I quoted from our Constitution during that first lecture, and it does point at these issues as well, the question of rights, Bill of Rights and land and education and everything else. But then came another act, and this government happened to rope me in for this 2003 Traditional Leadership and Governance Act, to look at traditional leadership as such. Because what also happened in the previous dispensation, quite artificially, people were set up as leaders, headmen and chiefs and all sorts of things, because they had all these parcels of land that had to be governed indirectly by the central government through